The Eastern Front of World War II was marked by an enemy as ruthless as the opposing armies, the Russian climate. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, from the outset showed German ambitions to conquer vast stretches of Soviet territory. However, the climate, as unpredictable as it was brutal, became an insurmountable adversary for the Wehrmacht troops. The extreme cold, icy winds and continuous snowfall were only the beginning of the suffering. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, freezing equipment and leaving German troops ill-equipped to survive in such a harsh environment. Many Wehrmacht soldiers began to suffer from hypothermia, with some losing limbs due to frostbite and others dying along the way. Vehicles got stuck in the deep snow, weapons malfunctioned, and logistics became completely overwhelmed. From victory to collapse, the Wehrmacht against cold and mud. The initial summer seemed favorable. With cool temperatures around 20 degrees Celsius, the Nazi advance was rapid and effective. Within a few months, they took strategic cities like Smolensk and captured vast expanses of territory. Despite resistance from the communist power, the morale among German soldiers was high, fueled by early successes. However, this optimism soon began to crumble. The summer heat and long marching days exhausted the troops and depleted logistical resources, while the supply lines stretched dangerously into the Russian interior, hindering resupply. Summer gave way to autumn, bringing with it the dreaded Rasputitsa, a period during which incessant rains turned roads into impassable mud pits. Vehicles became bogged down in the mud, and the German advance slowed drastically. Increasingly exhausted troops saw their initial momentum halted not only by Soviet forces, who took the opportunity to regroup and launch counterattacks, but also by terrain that seemed to ally with their enemies. This period marked the beginning of German attrition. When winter came, it did so with a ferocity that exceeded all expectations. Temperatures began to plummet in November and December, reaching 20 degrees below zero, and in January, 30 degrees below zero in several regions. The winter of 1941 was one of the harshest recorded, and the Wehrmacht was completely unprepared. Some German soldiers used newspapers to try to insulate themselves from the cold, but these measures proved ineffective against the relentless frost. Frostbite casualties and diseases like pneumonia increased dramatically, further weakening an already exhausted army. Meanwhile, the Russian military showed much better preparation for facing the winter. Equipped with padded coats, fur hats, and lined boots, they endured the climate more effectively and took advantage of their situation. In December of 1941, they launched a counter-offensive that forced the demoralized and physically deteriorated German forces to retreat. This movement marked the end of the advance towards Moscow, ending the German offensive phase on the Eastern Front and showing the first cracks in the apparent invincibility of the Nazi army. The subsequent seasons continued to be a crucial factor in the war's progression. In 1942, during Operation Blue, the occupying enemies attempted to move south in search of the Caucasus oil fields. Although this offensive took place in the summer, the accumulated wear and Soviet resistance limited its reach. By winter, the climatic tragedy struck again during the Battle of Stalingrad, where extreme temperatures and lack of resources condemned the German Sixth Army. In January of the following year, with temperatures challenging human survival, the Germans surrendered, marking a turning point in the conflict. But these are just some of the details associated with the climate during those events. There are many data points yet to be reviewed that shaped the war's destiny. To start, one could cite the often unusual resilience of the invaded. The surprise attack launched by Germany on the Eastern Front deployed over 3 million soldiers across a vast territory, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. In the first weeks, the impact was devastating for the Soviet Union. Millions of combatants captured, vast areas occupied, and incalculable material losses. Despite this initial blow, Russian resistance began to consolidate, marking the beginning of a prolonged and brutal struggle that would unfold over years. The climate played a crucial role from the beginning. While the poorly equipped German forces fought against the extreme cold, Soviet soldiers showed an amazing ability to withstand and adapt to the climate. Their equipment, which included woolen clothing and coats specifically designed for winter, allowed them to maintain combat effectiveness even when temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. In contrast, the invaders, dressed in inadequate uniforms, faced the climate with desperate improvisation attempts that were insufficient against the relentless frost. The cold not only physically affected the troops, but also psychologically impacted the battlefield. In a recurring scene, German troops watched, bewildered, as Russian soldiers continued to advance even after receiving fatal wounds, as if the pain could not penetrate the layers of their icy resistance. This phenomenon, fueled by the neurological lethargy caused by extreme cold, transformed the Red Army fighters into spectral figures that defied expectations and terrified the invaders. To put it another way, it was as if the cold endowed them with a natural sedative that allowed them to continue acting on the battlefield. They received bullet impacts without feeling pain at that moment. The Soviets' familiarity with their environment gave them a decisive advantage. The dense forests and snow-covered mountains became natural allies that favored ambushes and surprise attacks. During the Battle of Moscow in December 1941, the troops of the invaded country took advantage of the Germans' exhaustion and poor preparation to launch devastating counter-offensives. In parallel, Russian partisans, hidden in rural and wooded areas, adopted guerrilla tactics that included nocturnal ambushes and the scorched earth strategy, destroying resources that could have sustained the enemy. The so-called General Winter played a central role in the Russian resistance. Instead of merely enduring the cold, they used it as a strategic weapon. This extreme climate, combined with communist tactical ingenuity, proved decisive in Operation Uranus. In this operation, the Soviets surrounded the German forces, executing surprise attacks and using snow and ice to cover their movements. The resilience of the invaded was not limited to their ability to survive. It was an active force that attacked even in the most extreme circumstances. The soldiers, hardened by previous conflicts such as the Winter War against Finland, were not only capable of withstanding the cold, they used it as a combat tool. As they advanced, they seemed undisturbed by wounds and the climate, moving forward with a determination that defied human limitations. In the following years, this combination of resilience, adaptation, and knowledge of the terrain was crucial to stopping the German offensive and ultimately reversing the course of the conflict. Cornered and defenseless, how the cold prevented the Wehrmacht from advancing or retreating. The vast territory of the Soviet Union, with its immensity and hostility, became a deadly trap for German forces during World War II, hindering both their advances and their attempts to retreat and establish new defensive positions. The extension of the front, which spanned from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, posed a monumental logistical challenge. The supply lines, dangerously stretched into the interior, became increasingly ineffective, making it difficult to transport troops and necessary resources to sustain prolonged operations. The extreme climate of the Eastern Front was one of the most devastating factors. In the winter of 1941, heavy snowfalls covered the terrain with layers of up to 1.5 meters of snow, hindering mobility and paralyzing vehicles and officers. To this situation was added the aforementioned Rasputitsa. The vehicles were stuck and the exhausted troops could barely move forward. These conditions not only slowed down operations, but also prevented the establishment of stable defenses and hindered the orderly retreat of German forces. The geography of Russian territory added an additional layer of difficulty. Dense forests, vast swamps, and broad rivers such as the Dnieper and the Volga divided the landscape, turning it into an inhospitable battlefield. These natural obstacles slowed down the German movement and at the same time favored the Soviet defenders, who took advantage of the terrain to organize counterattacks and ambushes. The logistical difficulties were not limited to the terrain and the climate. The infrastructure on the Eastern Front was gravely inadequate. The roads and railways were scarce and poorly maintained, unable to support the weight of a military operation of such magnitude. The German forces were forced to rely on improvised routes, which further exacerbated their inability to quickly move troops and supplies. These deficiencies became more evident as the conflict progressed, leaving the invading forces increasingly vulnerable. Summer offered no relief. High temperatures raised clouds of dust that reduced visibility, complicating coordination between units. The lack of water and shade physically exhausted the soldiers. weakening their fighting capacity. In this situation, retreating was almost as difficult as holding defensive positions. Caught between inhospitable terrain and an increasingly organized enemy, the German troops faced continuous attrition. The turning point came with Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944. The Soviets, taking advantage of German vulnerabilities, launched a devastating offensive that destroyed much of the Axis forces on the Eastern Front. The combination of challenging terrain, extreme climatic conditions, extended supply lines, and relentless pressure from Russian forces sealed the fate of the occupiers. Unable to advance or retreat, they were cornered in a scenario of inexorable decline. Despite their attempts to adapt and resist, the German effort crumbled in the face of the vastness of the territory, the hostile climate, and logistical inadequacies, turning this front into the stage for their defeat. Lack of food and medicine. The German logistical failure on the Eastern Front. The German supply lines on the Eastern Front during World War II faced a series of challenges that greatly complicated the advance and maintenance of the Third Reich's military effort. From the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, logistical problems began to arise, revealing an underestimation of both Soviet resistance and the natural and climatic obstacles of the region. As the German troops penetrated enemy territory, the distances between the fronts and supply bases alarmingly increased. For example, Moscow was nearly 1,600 kilometers from Berlin, making each resource shipment a complex and vulnerable operation. The Russian railway network, designed with a different track gauge than the European one, presented an immediate challenge. Although the Germans tried to adapt the captured infrastructure, the conversion work required time and resources that were scarce. The Soviets, on their part, systematically destroyed bridges, tracks, and other essential facilities during their retreat, further slowing down the invading logistical operations. Despite these efforts, land transport also faced great limitations due to the lack of adequate roads and terrain that combined vast plains with mountainous areas, dense forests, and wide rivers. The extreme climate was undoubtedly one of the most determining factors in the German logistical collapse. The Russian winters, with temperatures frequently dropping below 30 degrees Celsius, turned the supply transport into a titanic task. The truck engines froze, the fuel lost efficiency, and the mechanical systems suffered constant breakdowns. In many cases, the vehicles became unusable, leaving the troops without access to the necessary resources for their survival and operability. Food often arrived frozen, requiring additional effort to prepare under precarious conditions. The rations were insufficient in quantity and quality, which physically weakened the soldiers and affected their morale. Field kitchens became a crucial tool, although they depended on the availability of local ingredients or those supplied by the supply lines. However, looting and foraging in conquered areas also became common practices, especially when the supply lines were unable to meet basic needs. Rail transport, despite its limitations, remained one of the main ways to move large volumes of supplies. Nevertheless, train routes were vulnerable to sabotage and Soviet attacks, in addition to facing significant delays due to the necessary technical adaptations. Truck convoys, essential for reaching more remote areas, also suffered from the terrain and climate. During the winters, the roads were covered with ice, while spring rains and thawing turned the paths into impassable mud. In an attempt to overcome these difficulties, the Germans resorted to using sleds pulled by native horses known as panzers. Although sturdy, these animals could not meet the logistical demands of an expanding army. Transporting medicines in extreme cold was a challenge, as many required specific storage conditions to maintain their effectiveness. Freezing compromised these products, while the lack of an efficient logistical system left many soldiers without access to necessary medical care. This increased the incidence of diseases and mortality from treatable injuries, expanding the casualties not only on the battlefield, but also in the rear areas. The Russian resistance took full advantage of these logistical weaknesses. The scorched earth tactics, combined with the mobilization of industry to less accessible eastern regions, ensured that the invaders could not benefit from local resources. At the same time, Western allies provided military material and supplies to the Soviet Union, strengthening their capabilities and increasing the pressure on the already strained German supply lines. In fact, It is estimated that the United States provided nearly 2 million tons of food during this process. Although the Nazis tried to establish strategic depots and improve their transport methods, these measures proved insufficient in the face of the magnitude of the challenges. Improvised solutions, such as using secondary roads or transporting in small convoys, could not compensate for the structural and strategic failures of a logistical system that, from its conception, was not prepared for the demands of a campaign in such a vast and hostile territory. Scrap metal thanks to the ice, the useless German tanks. During World War II, German tanks played a crucial role on the Eastern Front, with models that marked technological and strategic milestones. The Panzer IV, initially designed with a 75mm gun, established itself as a versatile medium tank, capable of adapting to both infantry support and direct combat against other armored vehicles. Its frontal armor reached 80mm in advanced versions, showing its evolution in response to the conflict's demands. In 1943, the Panzer V Panther was introduced as a direct response to the Soviet T-34. This model, with frontal armor up to 100mm and an inclined design that increased protection, stood out for its 75mm gun and a maximum speed of 55 km per hour. Despite being one of the best tanks of the conflict, its initial mechanical problems limited its battlefield performance. On the other hand, the Panzer VI Tiger I symbolized the power of German heavy tanks. Armed with an 88mm gun, it was capable of destroying its enemies from long distances. Its frontal armor of up to 120mm and its weight of 57 tons made it formidable but less maneuverable, a significant disadvantage in difficult terrains. With these tanks as a backdrop, the intense cold winters from 1941 onwards affected not only the troops but also the vehicles, whose internal mechanisms froze due to the thickening of lubricants. The occupying crews were forced to improvise solutions, such as lighting small fires under the tanks, to avoid severe damage to the engines during the nights. The deep snow, which could exceed 1.5 meters in some regions, added a significant obstacle. The German tanks, with narrower tracks, frequently got stuck in difficult terrains, a clear disadvantage compared to the Russian vehicles, which had wider and better adapted tracks. The reduced mobility of the German vehicles complicated offensive maneuvers and exposed the units to well-planned Soviet ambushes. Meanwhile, inside the German tanks, the crews suffered from constant cold, as these vehicles did not have effective heating systems. Although the armor and firepower of vehicles like the Panzer IV, Panther and Tiger I were formidable in theory, their practical performance was compromised in snowy and icy terrains. The tracks of the Panther and Tiger Is in particular proved inadequate for the muddy terrain left by the spring thaw and the frozen mud of winter. These mobility problems not only slowed operations, but also increased the vulnerability of the invading units to counterattacks by the defenders. The unreliability of their vehicles sharply contrasted with the simplicity and efficiency of the T-34 design, which facilitated quick repairs even under adverse conditions. In addition to being better equipped, the Russian troops employed strategies designed to maximize the difficulties faced by the German tanks in such winter conditions. Minefields, ambushes, and the use of terrain as a tactical advantage were key factors that further limited German effectiveness. The Soviets exploited their knowledge of the terrain and their climate-adapted vehicles to strengthen their resistance and offensive capacity. Meanwhile, the long days in extreme climatic conditions, combined with the inability to maintain the mobility and effectiveness of the tanks, led to physical and psychological exhaustion. As if this scenario wasn't enough, during the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, these tanks faced an overwhelming numerical superiority of the invaded country. Germany deployed nearly 3,000 armored vehicles, relying on their advanced technology. However, Soviet tactics such as defense in depth, the massive use of mines, and ambushes with buried tanks effectively countered the capabilities of the occupiers. The combination of precise intelligence and coordinated counterattacks ensured a fierce resistance, marking a turning point in the conflict in favor of the Allies. Night surveillance equipment, cold, dust, and long distances on the Eastern Front. In the final years of World War II, German forces on the Eastern Front faced the need to adapt to a war environment marked by increasing tactical and technological disadvantages. In this context, the implementation of the Zielgerät 1229, also known as Vampir, a night vision system that employed active infrared technology, emerged, marking a notable advancement in military innovation of the era. The development of the Vampire focused on providing German soldiers the ability to operate effectively in low-visibility situations, where the use of conventional methods was limited. Its use was fundamental in the context of these latitudes, as the geographic and climatic particularities of this region were exacerbated at night and required additional efforts. This vast territory, marked by a variety of terrains and extreme climatic conditions, not only shaped military logistics, but also left a lasting imprint on night tactics. This device integrated with the STG-44 assault rifle and consisted of an infrared light projector and an image converter, allowing operators to visualize targets in total darkness without being detected. Although its range was relatively limited, less than 100 meters, it offered a crucial tactical advantage in certain nocturnal situations. The complete set, including a portable battery necessary for its operation, weighed approximately 14 kilograms, a burden that the crews had to carry during operations. Introduced in late 1944, the use of the Vampir was restricted to a limited number of units, with an estimated production of 310 devices. Despite its limited distribution, the system was assigned to specialized military units known as Nachtjäger, or night hunters. These combatants were specifically selected and trained to carry out ambushes and surprise attacks during the night, leveraging the cover of darkness to overcome the strategic disadvantages faced by German forces. The dense forests covering extensive areas of the terrain provided natural cover that favored stealth and concealment. These characteristics allowed the Nachtjäger to move undetected. However, this same vegetation density complicated navigation and increased the risks of disorientation or enemy ambushes. The plains and hills interspersed with these forests also played a dual role. While they could offer a strategic view of the surroundings, they also concealed traps and mines, requiring careful planning before any operation. The Nachtjäger worked in shifts to ensure continuous surveillance, using the Vampir to detect enemy movements while remaining hidden in the darkness. The climate, in this context, added an additional layer of complexity to nocturnal missions. The effectiveness of the Vampire was reduced due to batteries weakened by the cold. This sight significantly increased the load that the soldiers had to carry, further hindering mobility. The prolonged winter nights offered a temporary advantage as they extended the period for conducting night missions. However, this same prolonged darkness limited natural visibility, forcing the officers to rely almost exclusively on their technological devices. The lack of moonlight exacerbated these difficulties, making terrain recognition and target identification considerably more arduous tasks. The soldiers had to carry out detailed reconnaissance missions, mapping the terrain and locating potential obstacles or ambush points. The psychological impact of these extreme conditions was not minor. The combination of cold, darkness, and long distances generated a significant level of stress among the troops. Physical fatigue, resulting from the additional weight of the equipment and the relentless climate, was amplified by the mental strain of operating in a hostile and low-visibility environment. The soldiers were forced to remain constantly alert, a task that consumed both physical and emotional energy. To mitigate these challenges, rigorous maintenance of the technological equipment was fundamental. The batteries had to be protected from the cold, and the night vision devices required frequent checks to ensure their functionality. Additionally, the Nachtjäger received specialized training that included stealth and combat tactics under extreme cold conditions. This training allowed them to operate effectively even on the darkest nights and in frozen terrains. Meanwhile, the reflective surface of the snow could dazzle the officers, further complicating navigation and the effectiveness of the night vision equipment. In response to these difficulties, the troops developed traditional methods to complement the technology, such as the use of acoustic signals and proximity tactics to detect enemy movements. In this scenario, advanced technology, though essential, did not always guarantee the expected success. The lack of moonlight posed another significant obstacle. The extremely dark nights complicated ambushes and strategic movements, as the soldiers had to rely on alternative methods for orientation. Under these circumstances, operations were carefully planned to coincide with clearer nights, when stars or natural light sources provided some additional visibility. Massive military and civilian losses. The Eastern Front as a slaughterhouse for Germans and Soviets. The Eastern Front of World War II represented one of the most significant human tragedies in contemporary history, with massive human losses in both the military and civilian spheres. In the military sphere, it is estimated that approximately 6.5 million German and other Axis troops lost their lives in this region. These figures constitute more than 60% of all recorded German casualties during the conflict. By the end of December 1944, German medical reports accounted for 1,419,728 soldiers who had died from various causes. On the Soviet side, military losses were also devastating. More than 8 million officers of the Red Army died in combat or during captivity as prisoners of war. At the same time, this army captured around 5,700,000 German soldiers, many of whom did not survive the treatment they received as prisoners. However, civilian losses far exceeded military ones. In the communist power, it is estimated that 26 million people died due to the conflict. Of this total, 20 million were civilians, victims of Nazi occupation, famines, and systematic genocides. In Poland, around 6 million citizens lost their lives, more than half of whom were of Jewish origin. Similarly, in Belarus and Ukraine, it was reported that more than 20% of the civilian population was killed. The impact of cold weather and geography on the Eastern Front during World War II proved to be a determining factor in human losses, both civilian and military. This extreme cold found the German troops completely unprepared with adequate equipment to face it. The lack of winter clothing and basic winter supplies condemned many soldiers to suffer severe frostbite on extremities such as hands and feet. In many cases, these injuries resulted in amputations and, frequently, death. Records indicate that approximately 14,000 officers required amputations as a direct result of these conditions. Moreover, prolonged exposure to the cold weakened the troops, making them vulnerable to respiratory diseases like pneumonia, which spread rapidly in an environment where access to medicine was limited. The geography of the Eastern Front only amplified the challenge imposed by the climate. The vast steppes and frozen rivers became deadly traps for the German troops, while the Soviet forces took advantage of the terrain to launch strategic counteroffensives, especially during episodes such as the Battle of Stalingrad. In this campaign, the Volga River, frozen by low temperatures, served as a transport and maneuver route for the Russian forces, allowing them to resupply and reinforce relatively easily. The deep snow, the storms, and the constant threat of freezing not only hindered military operations, but also plunged the troops into a state of despair. Adverse psychological conditions led many to succumb to stress or even suicide. For some, the only option seemed to be the desperate retreat to Germany, but these escape attempts often ended in tragedy. The soldiers attempting to return faced endless stretches of snowy terrain, where extreme temperatures and lack of shelter quickly claimed lives. Hypothermia became a common cause of death, while others succumbed to hunger due to the lack of provisions during their futile journey. Those who managed to evade the Soviet forces and the cold often faced an equally cruel fate: extreme exhaustion or capture. Mortality on the Eastern Front reached alarming levels. During the first months of the winter of 1941, around 23% of German troops succumbed to the harsh weather conditions or related diseases. It is estimated that in total more than 250,000 German soldiers suffered frostbite, while thousands died directly due to the cold. After the conflict, more harrowing details came to light. In several areas, mass graves were discovered with the frozen bodies of invading officers. Subsequent investigations also revealed how these extreme conditions affected the civilians of the occupied areas, who suffered massacres, forced displacements, and abandonment in equally inhumane circumstances. While the Soviets managed to adapt better to the environment, the Germans paid a high price for their lack of preparation. The impact of the Eastern Front is unparalleled in historical terms. In contrast, fronts like the Western or the Pacific, though also devastating, recorded significantly fewer losses in comparison.